You've entered void of rules, where chaos reigns and darkness consumes all. In this twisted realm where all laws have crumbled, only one rule remains, and those who break it are cast into eternal digital oblivion. The rule is simple: subscribe. We're almost at 4,000 corrupted souls, but the void hungers for more. Our goal is 10,000 subscribers before this year bleeds into darkness. Will you join our legion, or face the consequences of defying the void? Now let's jump into today's story. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune as I unlocked the back door to the McDonald's on Elm Street. 10:30 at night, same as always. The building sat on the edge of Millbrook, like a tired sentinel, its golden arches flickering against the October sky. Half the town had dried up over the years, leaving rows of empty storefronts and cracked sidewalks, but somehow this place kept running. Had to, I suppose. Someone needed to work the graveyard shift. My name is Ethan Crowley, and I've been training night crews at this McDonald's for the past 5 years. Started as just another kid flipping burgers when I was 22, fresh out of community college, with nowhere else to go. Management kept promoting me every time someone else quit or, well, stopped showing up. Now I'm the guy they call when they need someone broken in for the overnight hours. It's not glamorous work, but it pays the bills. And in a town like Millbrook, steady employment is worth its weight in gold. What they don't tell you in the employee handbook is that this particular McDonald's has been here longer than most people remember. The building went up in 1962, but something else stood on this spot before that. Old-timers in town sometimes mention a boarding house that burned down in the 50s, taking 13 people with it. Others talk about an even older structure, something from the 1800s that the county records seem to have lost track of. All I know is that the ground beneath this place feels different when you're here alone at 3 in the morning, like it's watching you back. What I've never told anyone is what I found in the basement during my 3rd year here. There shouldn't be a basement. The building plans on file with the city show a concrete slab foundation, nothing more. But sometimes late at night when I'm taking inventory, I hear sounds coming from beneath the floor. Scratching, whispering, footsteps that don't match the rhythm of anyone walking upstairs. I found the entrance by accident, hidden behind a loose panel in the supply closet. A narrow staircase leading down into darkness that smells like wet earth and something else, something organic and wrong. I only went down there once, but it was enough. The basement stretches far beyond the building's footprint, with tunnels branching off in directions that shouldn't exist, and carved into the walls, hundreds of names. Some old, some recent. Some I recognized from employee records of people who'd worked here and disappeared. At the far end of the main tunnel, there's a room. In that room, there's a well. And in that well, something lives. Something that feeds on what we bring it, night after night, year after year. Tonight I had 3 new hires waiting for me in the break room. The day manager, Mrs. Patterson, had left their files on my desk with a note that simply read, "Good luck, hope these last longer than the last batch." She'd been saying variations of that more often lately. The last batch had lasted exactly 4 days before they all stopped showing up for work within hours of each other. The first kid was Liam Porter, 19 years old, college dropout with an attitude that said he thought this job was beneath him. His application mentioned a partial scholarship to State University that he'd lost due to academic difficulties, which probably meant partying. He wore his contempt for the job like armour, probably figured he'd work here a few months, save some money, then move on to bigger and better things. They always think that. Naomi Green sat next to him, 23, single mother, with tired eyes and calloused hands that spoke of previous manual labour jobs. Her application was meticulous, every line filled out in careful handwriting, references from 3 previous employers. She needed this job desperately, you could tell, the kind of desperation that makes people overlook things they probably shouldn't. Her daughter was 6 years old, living with Naomi's mother while she worked nights. That information wasn't on the application, but you learn to read between the lines in this business. Then there was Tyler Walsh, 17, quiet kid with nervous energy, who kept checking his phone every few minutes. His application said he was a senior at Millbrook High, saving up for a car so he could escape to bigger cities after graduation. Dreams of independence, freedom, all that teenage stuff. He reminded me of myself at that age, back when I thought working nights at McDonald's would be temporary. "All right, gather around," I said, setting down my keys and thermos of coffee. The coffee was a necessity, not a choice. 5 years of graveyard shifts had taught me that caffeine was the only thing standing between me and the kind of exhaustion that makes you see things that aren't there. Or maybe they are there, and the exhaustion just makes you notice them. Welcome to the McDonald's night shift. I'm Ethan, and I'll be training you for the next week. Before we get started on the register systems and food prep, there's something important we need to go over. I led them through the kitchen area towards the manager's office. The restaurant looked different in the dimmed overnight lighting, shadows pooling in corners that seemed perfectly normal during the day. The hum of the refrigeration units was more noticeable now, creating an almost rhythmic backdrop that could sound like whispers if you let your imagination run wild. But it wasn't imagination. If you listened carefully, really carefully, you could make out words in that humming. Names, mostly. The names of everyone who'd ever worked here and never left. The manager's office was a cramped space that smelled like stale coffee and industrial cleaning supplies. Taped to the inside of the door was a laminated sheet of paper, yellowed with age, the corners curled from years of handling. The ink had faded to a dull blue, but the words were still legible. I'd memorized them years ago, but I still read from the sheet during training. Ritual was important. "These are the night shift rules," I said, my voice taking on the serious tone I'd perfected over the years. "Every person who's lasted more than a week on this shift follows these rules, without question. Those who don't follow them, well, they don't work here anymore." Liam snorted, that predictable teenage arrogance bubbling up. "Rules? Come on, man, it's McDonald's. How complicated can it be? Flip burgers, take orders, clean stuff, right?" I ignored him and began reading from the sheet, enunciating each word clearly. Rule number 1, never look directly at the clown mascot mural after midnight. Rule number 2, do not serve anyone who approaches the drive-thru on foot. Rule number 3, if a customer orders something not on the menu, act like you didn't hear them. Rule number 4, between 3:15 and 3:30 in the morning, keep all fryers running, but do not cook anything. Rule number 5, if you hear knocking from inside the walk-in freezer, do not open the door. Rule number 6, check the bathrooms every hour, but never enter the third stall. Rule number 7, when the lobby lights flicker, turn off all music and remain completely silent until they stop. The three of them stared at me in the fluorescent glow of the office. Tyler's face had gone pale, his nervous energy shifting into something closer to fear. Naomi looked confused but attentive, the way people do when they're trying to figure out if you're joking or serious. Liam was grinning, like I'd just told him the world's dumbest joke. "You're serious about this?" Naomi said. It wasn't a question. Dead serious. These aren't suggestions or corporate hazing or some kind of team-building exercise. These rules exist for a reason, and that reason is keeping you safe during your shift. "Safe from what?" Tyler asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I met his eyes and saw something I recognized. The same nervousness I'd felt on my first night shift here. The instinctive understanding that something about this place was fundamentally wrong. From whatever lives in this place after the sun goes down. What I didn't tell them was that the rules weren't really for their protection. They were feeding instructions, guidelines for how to prepare the offerings, how to present them properly, how to make sure they were accepted. The thing in the basement was particular about its meals. It preferred them young, desperate, and properly seasoned with fear and confusion. Liam burst out laughing, the sound echoing off the cramped office walls. "Oh, come on, this is just some psychological manipulation, right? Make us think there's something spooky about working nights, so we'll be more obedient employees. Classic corporate mind games." "Believe what you want," I said, folding the rules sheet and tucking it back behind the door. "Just follow the rules. I've been training people for this shift for 5 years. And the ones who follow the rules are the ones who make it through their first week." "And the ones who don't?" Naomi asked. I was quiet for a moment, thinking about Jeremy, who'd laughed at rule number 2 and served a walk-in customer last month. We'd found his uniform in the parking lot the next morning, shredded and stained with something that definitely wasn't ketchup. Or Amanda, who'd insisted on checking the third stall during her second night. The day crew found her ID badge floating in the toilet the next morning, but never found Amanda herself. "The ones who don't follow the rules stop showing up for work," I said finally, "usually after their first or second shift." What I really wanted to tell them was that I'd started keeping a journal. 5 years of entries documenting every trainee, every rule violation, every disappearance. The patterns were clear once you knew how to look for them. The thing in the basement needed regular feeding, roughly every 3 to 4 days. The rules weren't arbitrary corporate policies. They were a careful system designed to ensure a steady supply of victims while maintaining plausible deniability. We spent the next hour going over the basics: register operation, food safety protocols, cleaning procedures, standard McDonald's training material, except I kept weaving in reminders about the rules. When I showed them how to operate the fryers, I pointed out the timer we'd use for that 15-minute window between 3:15 and 3:30. When I walked them through bathroom maintenance procedures, I made sure they understood which stall was off limits and why the hourly checks were so important. The restaurant felt different at night. Always had, even before I understood why. During the day, it was just another fast food joint, fluorescent bright and bustling with the usual crowd of families and workers grabbing quick meals. The golden arches drew people in, with promises of familiar comfort food and predictable service. But after 10 o'clock, when the last of the day shift clocked out and the overhead lights dimmed to their overnight setting, the whole place seemed to exhale and settle into something else entirely. The shadows stretched longer, reaching into corners that seemed perfectly normal 12 hours earlier. The hum of the refrigeration unit sounded almost like voices if you listened too carefully, mumbling conversations in a language that hurt your ears to concentrate on. Every creak of the building settling made you jump, especially if you were new. There were other changes too, subtler ones that took time to notice. The temperature dropped a few degrees after midnight, regardless of what the thermostat was set to. The ice machine made sounds that didn't quite match its normal operation, grinding and clicking in rhythms that almost sounded like Morse code. And sometimes, if you stood in just the right spot near the drive-thru window, you could hear traffic sounds from outside, even when the parking lot was completely empty. But the most disturbing change was in the building itself. Walls that should have been solid sometimes gave way when you leaned against them, revealing glimpses of spaces that shouldn't exist. Doorways appeared in places where there had been blank walls just hours before, and if you walked the perimeter of the building during your break, you'd notice that it was larger on the inside than it was on the outside, defying basic geometry in ways that made your head hurt to think about. Around 11:15, we started getting our first customers of the night. Late shift workers from the hospital mostly, grabbing coffee and breakfast sandwiches before their rounds. A few truckers passing through on Interstate 87 looking for something hot and cheap. Normal people with normal orders, the kind of routine transactions that made the job feel ordinary and safe. I let the trainees handle the simple orders while I supervised. watching how they interacted with the register system and the food prep equipment. Naomi was methodical and careful, double-checking everything before moving to the next step. Tyler was nervous but followed instructions well, his hands shaking slightly as he operated the coffee machine. Liam handled the register with casual confidence, chatting easily with customers like he'd been doing this for months instead of hours. It was 11:45 when the walk-in customer showed up. I was restocking napkin dispensers in the lobby when I saw the figure approaching from the direction of the interstate. At first, I thought it might be someone whose car had broken down in the parking lot. But as he got closer, I realized he was alone. No vehicle in sight. No disabled car on the shoulder of the road. Just a man in a stained business suit, walking with jerky, unnatural movements across the empty asphalt toward our drive-thru lane. This was how it always started. The walk-in customers were scouts, sent by the thing in the basement to test new employees, to see who would follow the rules and who could be marked for later collection. "Liam," I called out, moving quickly toward the kitchen area, stepped back from the drive-thru window. But Liam was already sliding the window open, that cocky grin still plastered across his face. He probably thought I was testing him, seeing if he'd follow the rules when the moment came. "Evening, sir. Welcome to McDonald's. How can I help you tonight?" The man stopped directly in front of the window, close enough that I could see his face clearly through the glass. His skin was pale, almost grey, with a waxy texture that reminded me of old candles. His eyes were bloodshot, the whites turned yellow like he had jaundice, and when he opened his mouth to speak, I caught a glimpse of teeth that were too sharp and too numerous. "I'd like meat that still remembers being alive," he said, his voice wet and thick, like he had fluid in his lungs. The blood drained from Liam's face, but he recovered quickly, probably thinking this was just some drunk trying to be funny. Sorry, could you repeat that? I didn't quite catch your order." The man leaned closer to the window, close enough that his breath fogged the glass. When he spoke again, his voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried clearly through the restaurant. "Fresh meat. Still warm. Still knowing what it used to be. Still remembering the feeling of a heartbeat." I stepped forward and tried to catch Liam's attention, gesturing frantically for him to close the window, but the kid was frozen. The man reached into his jacket with movements that seemed too fluid, like his joints bent in directions they shouldn't, and pulled out a handful of crumpled bills. "Here's payment," the man said, dropping the money onto the drive-thru counter. "I'll wait as long as it takes." Liam, moving like he was in a trance, picked up the bills and put them in the register. They felt damp under his fingers, slick and warm, and they smelled like copper pennies mixed with something organic and rotten. When he looked up to tell the man we'd need a few minutes to prepare his order, the drive-thru lane was empty. "Where did he go?" Liam asked, spinning around to face me, his voice higher than normal. I opened the register drawer and pulled out the bills the man had left. They were stained dark red, almost black in places, and they reeked of iron and decay. When I held them up to the light, I could see what looked like fingerprints pressed into the paper, but the prints were too large and had too many ridges to be human. But there was something else about the bills, something I'd learned to recognize over the years. They were warm, almost hot to the touch, and they seemed to pulse gently like a slow heartbeat. When I held them close to my ear, I could hear faint whispers in a language I didn't recognize, promises and threats spoken in voices that sounded like they were coming from very far away. "Rule number 2, I said quietly, dropping the bills into the trash can. "We don't serve people who come to the drive-thru on foot." "But he was just here. He gave me money. Where could he have gone that fast?" "Look at what he gave you, Liam." He stared at the stained bills I'd thrown away, and I watched the colour drain from his face for the second time that night. What is that stuff?" "Nothing you want to think about too hard." I washed my hands thoroughly in the prep sink, scrubbing until the smell of iron faded. From now on, if someone approaches the drive-thru without a car, you pretend you don't see them. Close the window, walk away, find me if you have to, but don't engage with them. Understood? Liam nodded, but I could see his hands shaking as he wiped down the counter around the register. The swagger was gone now, replaced by the kind of nervous energy that meant he was finally taking this seriously. What he didn't know, what none of them ever knew, was that taking the money had marked him. The walk-in customers didn't just test compliance with the rules, they tagged potential offerings. The bills carried a scent that only the thing in the basement could detect, a pheromone that marked Liam as suitable prey. He had maybe 2 more shifts before something came to collect him. The next few hours passed quietly. We served the usual late-night crowd, handled some simple food prep for the morning rush, went through the standard cleaning routines. Naomi was a quick learner, methodical and careful with every task. She asked good questions about procedure and seemed genuinely interested in doing the job well. Tyler stayed nervous but followed instructions without complaint, his earlier anxiety settling into focused concentration. Liam had gotten noticeably quieter after the drive-thru incident, which I took as a good sign. Maybe he was finally understanding that the rules weren't arbitrary corporate nonsense. Around 12:30, we heard the knocking. It started soft at first, just 3 gentle taps from somewhere in the back of the restaurant. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was muffled, like someone wearing gloves, and it seemed to come from the direction of the walk-in freezer. Probably just the ice machine settling, I said, though I knew it wasn't. The ice machine made plenty of noise, but nothing that sounded like deliberate knocking. We all stopped what we were doing and listened. For a moment, there was only the usual hum of refrigeration units and the distant buzz of fluorescent lights. Then, the knocking came again, more insistent this time. Tap, tap, tap. Tap, tap, tap. "It's definitely coming from the freezer," Naomi said, setting down the mop she'd been using to clean the lobby area. "Someone might be trapped in there." The knocking became frantic, desperate, a rapid staccato that echoed through the kitchen area, clearly coming from inside the walk-in freezer. It sounded exactly like someone pounding on the inside of the heavy door, the kind of panicked hammering that meant genuine distress. "I have to check," Naomi said, her maternal instincts clearly kicking in. She moved toward the freezer with purposeful strides. What if someone from the day shift got locked in? They could be freezing to death in there. I stepped into her path, blocking her access to the freezer door. Rule number 5. If you hear knocking from inside the freezer, do not open the door. But someone could be hurt. They could be dying in there. The knocking stopped abruptly, cut off mid-rhythm, like someone had suddenly clapped a hand over the noisemaker's mouth. In the sudden silence, we heard something else. A soft crying, high-pitched and plaintive, like a child in distress. The sound was muffled and distant, but unmistakably coming from inside the freezer. Naomi's face went white. "There's a kid in there," she whispered. The crying got louder, more desperate. It was the sound of a small child who was cold and scared and calling for help. Every instinct screamed that we needed to open that door and rescue whoever was trapped inside. "Please," came a small voice from beyond the freezer door. "Please help me. I'm so cold. I can't feel my fingers anymore." But I knew what was really in there. During my 3rd year, curiosity had gotten the better of me, and I'd violated rule number 5 myself. I'd opened that door during the knocking, and I'd seen what waited inside. The freezer was much larger than it should have been, stretching back into darkness that the overhead lights couldn't penetrate. Hanging from the ceiling were not just sides of beef and bags of frozen vegetables, but other things. Things wrapped in white cloth that were roughly human-shaped, suspended from hooks like sides of meat in a butcher shop. And in the back, sitting in a circle on the frozen floor, were the sources of the voices. Children, or things that looked like children, their skin blue-white with cold, their eyes black as winter nights. They wore the uniforms of employees who'd worked here over the years, name tags from decades past pinned to shirts that were too small for their growing bodies. When they saw me, they'd all turned to look in my direction, and they'd smiled with mouths full of ice crystals instead of teeth. "Join us," they'd whispered in unison, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "It's so much warmer when we're all together." I'd slammed the door shut and never opened it again, but I still heard them sometimes singing lullabies in harmony during the quiet hours before dawn. Naomi pushed past me and grabbed the freezer door handle. "There's definitely a child in there." Before I could stop her, she cracked the door open just an inch and peered inside. Her face went from white to grey, and she stumbled backward. "What do you see?" Tyler asked, moving closer. There are footprints in the frost, small ones, like a child's feet, but they're bare." She pushed the door open a little wider, and cold air billowed out into the kitchen. "They lead back into the freezer, but the prints, they don't look right." "Close the door," I said firmly, "but the child, close it now." She let the door swing shut, but I could see she was shaken. The crying had stopped when she'd opened the door, replaced by something that might have been whispering, too faint to make out the words. For the rest of the night, she kept glancing toward the freezer, and I noticed her jumping at every little sound. What I didn't tell her, what I couldn't tell any of them, was that I'd made the same mistake during my second week on the job. I'd opened that freezer door when the knocking started, thinking someone was trapped inside. The footprints had been there then too, small and bare and leading deeper into the freezer than should have been possible. When I'd followed them, the freezer had seemed to stretch back much farther than the building's dimensions allowed, and the temperature had dropped so fast that my breath turned to ice crystals before it left my mouth. The moment she'd opened that door, even just a crack, Naomi had been marked. The things in the freezer had seen her face, learned her scent, and now they knew exactly who she was. She had maybe one more shift before they came calling. Midnight came and went. I made sure everyone stayed busy with tasks that kept them away from the lobby area. Tyler was washing dishes in the back, Naomi was restocking supplies, and Liam was supposed to be cleaning the grill area and organising the prep station for the morning shift. That's when I found him standing in the dining room, staring at the wall. The Ronald McDonald mural covered most of the east wall of the lobby. It had been there since the restaurant opened back in the 80s, showing the famous clown mascot surrounded by other McDonald's characters in a colourful playground scene. Ronald stood in the centre, arms outstretched in welcome, surrounded by the Hamburglar, Grimace, and Mayor McCheese. During the day it looked cheerful and inviting, the kind of thing designed to make kids happy and parents nostalgic. But after midnight, something about it changed. The colours seemed more vibrant, like someone had gone over them with fresh paint. Ronald's smile appeared wider, stretching beyond the boundaries that the original artist had intended. His eyes tracked movement across the room, following you no matter where you stood. And sometimes, if you listened carefully, you could hear faint laughter coming from the direction of the wall. But there was more to it than that. Details you only noticed if you worked here long enough. The mural was a living record of everyone who'd ever worked the night shift. Hidden in the background, painted so subtly that you had to know where to look, were dozens of figures. Employees from over the years worked into the scene as if they'd always been part of the original design. I could see them all now, if I looked carefully enough. Jeremy, from last month, painted as one of the children playing on the swings. Amanda, from the week before, hidden among the crowd of happy families. Dozens of others stretched back across the decades, all smiling those painted smiles, but with eyes full of terror. "Tyler," I called out, "what are you doing out here?" He didn't respond. He was standing about 3 feet from the mural, just staring at Ronald McDonald's painted face. The clown's red smile seemed to pulse slightly, like a beating heart, and the yellow paint of his hair appeared to move in a non-existent breeze. "Tyler!" He jumped and spun around, tears streaming down his face. His eyes were wide and unfocused, like he'd been hypnotized. "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" "He said my name, the clown. He knows who I am." Tyler's voice was shaking. "He said we were going to be best friends forever. He said he's been waiting for someone like me." I grabbed Tyler by the shoulders and pulled him away from the mural, being careful not to look directly at it myself. Rule number 1. Never look directly at the clown mural after midnight. But he was talking to me. He said he knew about my plans to leave town after graduation. He said he could help me, give me everything I wanted, but I had to stay here with him. I guided him back toward the kitchen, but as we walked away, I could have sworn I heard something that sounded like disappointed sighing coming from the direction of the wall. When I glanced back over my shoulder, Ronald's painted hand seemed to be waving goodbye. And there, in the corner of the mural where an empty swing had been just moments before, was a new figure. A teenage boy who looked exactly like Tyler, painted in the same style as the rest of the scene, sitting on the swing with a smile that didn't reach his terrified eyes. The rest of the hour was tense. Everyone was on edge, jumping at shadows and strange sounds. The restaurant felt colder, and the usual background noises seemed louder and more intrusive. Around 1:30, I decided some fresh air might help everyone calm down. "Tyler," I said, "why don't you take out the trash? The night air will do you good." He nodded eagerly, clearly wanting to get away from the oppressive atmosphere inside the restaurant. I watched him gather up the trash bags and head for the back door, grateful for a few minutes of normalcy. He never came back. At 2:15, I went looking for him. The back door was propped open with a brick, letting in the cold October air. I found his uniform folded neatly on top of the dumpster, still warm, like he'd just taken it off. His shoes were there too, laces tied in perfect bows, positioned like he'd simply stepped out of them. "Tyler," I called out into the darkness behind the restaurant. "Tyler, this isn't funny. If you're hiding out here, you need to come back inside." But the only answer was the wind rustling through the empty lot. I checked around the dumpster, behind the building, even out in the parking lot near the road. There was no sign of him anywhere. It was like he'd simply vanished into thin air. What I found instead were footprints leading away from the dumpster toward the woods behind the restaurant. But these weren't Tyler's footprints. They were too small, like a child's, and they were bare despite the cold October ground. The prints led to the edge of the tree line and then disappeared, as if whoever had made them had simply stopped existing. When I came back inside, Liam and Naomi were waiting by the register, looking worried. "Where's Tyler?" Naomi asked. "He left," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Decided the job wasn't for him." Liam looked skeptical. "He just left, in the middle of his first shift, without saying anything, without even taking his car." He pointed toward the parking lot where Tyler's beat-up Honda Civic was still parked under one of the streetlights. "It happens more than you'd think," I said, but even I didn't believe it anymore. When I glanced towards the lobby, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The Ronald McDonald mural had changed again. Tyler was no longer on the swing in the corner. Now he was standing right next to Ronald McDonald, painted in the same cheerful style as the rest of the scene, wearing his McDonald's uniform and smiling that terrible painted smile. But his eyes were different from the others. While the rest of the trapped employees looked terrified, Tyler's painted eyes held a different emotion. Relief. 3:15 approached like an executioner's deadline. I'd been dreading this part of the shift for 5 years, and it never got easier. I gathered Liam and Naomi in the back of the kitchen and explained what was going to happen. In about 2 minutes, all the fryers are going to turn on by themselves. The oil is going to start bubbling, and it's going to get loud. Whatever you do, don't go near them. Don't try to turn them off. Don't try to cook anything. Just stay back and wait it out. "Why would they turn on by themselves?" Naomi asked. "I don't know, but it happens every night at 3:15 and it stops at 3:30. That's just how it is. Liam was staring at me like I'd lost my mind. Come on, man. Fryers don't just turn themselves on. Someone's obviously programmed them to do it. Probably for energy efficiency or something. Then explain why the manual override doesn't work, I said. I've tried everything. Unplugging them, flipping breakers, even calling a repair technician. Nothing stops it from happening. What I didn't tell them was that I knew exactly why the fryers turned on. During my second year, I'd made the mistake of watching too closely, and I'd seen what really happened during those 15 minutes. The fryers weren't just turning on randomly. They were being controlled, operated by hands that reached up from somewhere beneath the restaurant. Pale, thin arms that stretched impossibly long, emerging from drains and gaps in the floor to manipulate the controls with practiced efficiency. And the oil that bubbled and boiled during those 15 minutes wasn't just heating up. It was being stirred, mixed with ingredients that dropped down from the ceiling through vents that shouldn't exist. Powders and liquids that smelled like sulfur and rust, and things that had been dead for a very long time. Right on schedule, the fryers roared to life. All 6 of them, heating elements glowing red like the eyes of some enormous beast. Oil beginning to bubble and spit with violent intensity. The temperature gauges spun wildly, past the normal operating range into dangerous territory, and the sound was incredible, like the screaming of some enormous creature in pain. Jesus Christ, Liam whispered, covering his ears against the noise. So I kept them well back from the fryer station, but I couldn't help looking at the boiling oil. This was the part that had always fascinated and terrified me in equal measure. In the turbulent surface of the oil, shadows seemed to move beneath the liquid. Long, twisted shapes that looked almost like arms reaching upward, as if something was trying to climb out from the depths of the fryer baskets. The oil turned darker as the minutes passed, going from golden yellow to deep amber to nearly black. The smell changed too, from the usual pleasant aroma of French fries to something acrid and unpleasant, like burning hair mixed with sulfur. But tonight was different. Tonight the shapes in the oil were clearer, more defined. I could see what looked like faces pressing up against the surface from underneath. Mouths open in silent screams, eyes wide with terror. Some of them looked familiar. Jeremy, who'd broken rule number 2 last month. Amanda, who'd violated rule number 6. Other trainees from over the years. People who'd stopped showing up for work after ignoring my warnings. And there, in the fryer closest to where we stood, I saw Tyler's face. His mouth was moving, like he was trying to speak, but no sound came through the bubbling oil. His eyes locked onto mine, and I saw him mouth a single word. Help. But as I watched, something else appeared in the oil. Hands reaching up from below, wrapping around Tyler's painted face and pulling him deeper into the boiling liquid. And then he was gone, replaced by something else. Something older, with hollow eye sockets and a mouthful of needle-sharp teeth. It looked directly at me and smiled. At exactly 3:30, the fryers shut off as suddenly as they'd started. The oil settled into stillness, now black as tar and giving off wisps of oily smoke. The faces were gone, but I could still smell something burning that definitely wasn't food. "What the hell was that?" Liam demanded, his voice shaking. "Rule number 4, I said, my own voice not entirely steady. Between 3:15 and 3:30, keep the fryers running, but don't cook anything." "But why? What's the point? And what was that smell?" I didn't have an answer for him that he'd believe. I'd been working these shifts for 5 years, and I still didn't understand half of what happened in this place, after dark. I just knew the rules worked, and breaking them had consequences that went far beyond losing your job. What I was beginning to understand, though, was my role in all of this. I wasn't just a trainer, I was a shepherd, guiding lambs to slaughter. Every night I brought fresh victims to feed the thing that lived beneath us, and in return, it let me continue existing in this fluorescent purgatory. At 4 o'clock, it was time for the hourly bathroom check. Naomi volunteered, probably still feeling guilty about the freezer incident earlier. I should have gone myself, should have followed protocol, and never let a trainee handle the bathroom check alone. But I was dealing with a malfunctioning register that kept randomly opening the cash drawer, and I figured she'd be fine as long as she followed the rules. She'd proven herself capable and careful throughout the night. She'd listened to my warnings, followed every instruction, kept her composure, even when things got strange. I trusted her to stick to rule number 6. I was wrong. She was gone for 10 minutes before I started to worry. The bathroom check should have taken 3 minutes at most, just a quick walk through to make sure everything was clean and properly stocked. When 15 minutes passed with no sign of her, I knew something was wrong. I found her flashlight on the bathroom floor, still flickering, casting crazy shadows on the tile walls. The beam swept back and forth across the ceiling, like a strobe light, making the whole space feel unstable and dreamlike. The first 2 stalls were empty, doors hanging open. The third stall door was closed, but I could see light spilling out from underneath the gap. "Naomi," I called out. "Naomi, where are you?" No response. I approached the third stall carefully, noting that the door, which was always supposed to stay locked, was now slightly ajar. The light coming from underneath wasn't the normal fluorescent glow of the bathroom fixtures. It was warmer, more yellow, and it pulsed gently like candlelight. I didn't look inside. Rule number 6 existed for a reason, and I'd learned long ago not to question it. But I could smell something coming from in there, something sweet and cloying, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. Mixed with that was another scent, copper and iron, that I recognized from the bills the walking customer had left earlier. But there was something else too, a sound that shouldn't have been possible in a bathroom stall, the gentle lapping of water against stone, like waves on a distant shore. And underneath that, barely audible, the sound of someone humming a lullaby. When I got back to the kitchen, Liam was pacing by the registers, his earlier skepticism completely gone, replaced by barely controlled panic. "Where's Naomi?" he demanded. "She went home early, wasn't feeling well." He stared at me for a long moment, his eyes wide with fear and disbelief. "She just left, like Tyler, without saying anything, without taking her purse." He pointed to the break room where Naomi's handbag sat on the table next to her car keys. "People quit, Liam, sometimes they just walk away." But I could see he wasn't buying it, and honestly, I didn't blame him. His hands were shaking again, and he kept glancing toward the bathroom corridor like he expected something to come walking out. The swagger and arrogance were completely gone now, replaced by the kind of raw terror that comes from finally understanding that the world isn't as safe and predictable as you thought. We made it to 4:30 without any major incidents. I was starting to think we might actually get through the rest of the shift when the lobby lights began to flicker. It started as a barely noticeable flutter in the fluorescent tubes, just enough to make you wonder if you'd imagined it. But within seconds it became a rapid strobing that filled the restaurant with epileptic flashes of light and shadow. The effect was disorienting, making it hard to tell where the walls were or which direction you were facing. I immediately shut off the radio and grabbed Liam by the arm. "Don't move," I whispered. "Don't speak. Don't even breathe loudly." "What's happening?" he whispered back, his voice barely audible. "Rule number 7. When the lights flicker, we stay silent until they stop." But Liam was losing it. 5 years of working nights had taught me to recognize the signs. The wide eyes, the rapid breathing, the way his whole body was starting to shake. He was reaching his breaking point, and people who broke down during the flickering lights never made it through. "This is insane," he said, his voice rising above a whisper. "People are disappearing. Tyler's gone, Naomi's gone, and you're acting like this is all normal." "Liam, you need to stay quiet. No, I'm done with this crazy place and your stupid rules." He was shouting now, his voice echoing off the walls and mixing with the electrical buzz of the flickering lights. "What is this place? What's really going on here? What happened to Tyler and Naomi?" The lights went out completely. In the absolute darkness, I heard something moving. Heavy footsteps that squelched wetly on the tile floor, like someone walking through mud or something worse. The sound circled us slowly, accompanied by deep, ragged breathing that smelled like decay and old meat. Whatever was moving around us was big, much larger than a person, and it moved with predatory patience. But this time, I could hear more than just footsteps. There were voices in the darkness, whispers in languages that predated human speech. And underneath it all, a sound I'd learned to recognize over the years. The gentle creaking of rope, like something heavy swaying from the ceiling. I grabbed Liam's arm, but he was sobbing now, completely hysterical. The wet footsteps stopped right beside us. Something brushed against my shoulder, cold and damp and wrong, like touching raw meat that had been left out too long. I heard Liam's sobbing cut off abruptly, replaced by a wet, choking sound. When the lights flickered back on, I was alone. Liam's shoes sat empty on the floor where he'd been standing, filled with what looked like ash or fine grey powder. The laces were still tied, as if his feet had simply dissolved inside them. Nearby, his uniform lay crumpled on the ground, but it was empty, like he'd somehow melted out of his clothes. But there was something new in the scene. Hanging from one of the ceiling tiles, barely visible unless you knew where to look, was a length of rope. And at the end of that rope, swaying gently in a breeze that shouldn't exist, was Liam's name tag. I stood there for a moment, surrounded by the familiar hum of the refrigeration units and the distant buzz of the fluorescent lights. Then I got back to work. The rest of the shift passed in a blur of routine tasks. I restocked supplies, cleaned equipment, and mopped the floors, where dark stains had appeared during the night. The grills seemed to be cooking phantom meals, sizzling and smoking, though I hadn't put any food on them. I could smell hamburgers and bacon, even what might have been human flesh, but when I lifted the lids, the surfaces were empty. Around 5:30, I noticed movement in the lobby. The Ronald McDonald mural had changed again. Tyler was still there, painted into the scene like he'd always been part of it. But now he'd been joined by Naomi and Liam. All three of them stood next to the clown, wearing McDonald's uniforms and smiling those painted smiles. But their eyes were wrong, filled with a terror that the artist had somehow managed to capture in simple brushstrokes. And there was something else. In the very corner of the mural, so small you'd miss it if you weren't looking carefully, was a new addition. A tiny figure standing in the shadows behind the playground equipment. A figure that looked exactly like me, wearing my training supervisor uniform, watching over the scene with eyes that held neither terror nor relief, just acceptance. At 6 o'clock sharp, the morning crew arrived. Janet from day shift bounced through the back door, with her usual cheerful energy, followed by 2 other workers I recognized. They moved through the restaurant like nothing had happened, turning on the full lighting system and raising the thermostat for the day shift temperature. "Morning, Ethan. How did the training go? The new kids work out okay?" I forced a smile and nodded, trying to match her cheerful tone. "Yeah, they learned a lot. Real quick learners." "That's great. We can always use good night shift people. It's so hard to find reliable employees these days." "Where are they now?" "Oh, they left a little early. First night jitters, you know how it is." Janet laughed, the sound bright and innocent in the fluorescent lighting. "Of course. Well, I'm sure they'll settle in just fine once they get used to the routine. You're such a good trainer, Ethan. I don't know how you do it, keeping people motivated for the night shift." She busied herself with opening procedures, counting down registers and checking supply levels. The other day, shift workers moved around me like I was invisible, going through their familiar routines. None of them seemed to notice the lingering smell of decay, or the way the temperature was still a few degrees too cold, or the faint sounds of movement coming from inside the walk-in freezer. "Oh, before I forget," Janet said, pulling a folder from behind the register, "Mrs. Patterson left this for you. 3 more new hires starting tomorrow night. Looks like we're finally getting some momentum on staffing the overnight shift." I took the folder and glanced at the applications inside. 3 more hopeful faces, 3 more people, looking for steady work in a dying town. Sarah Chen, 24, recent graduate, with a degree in hospitality management. Marcus Rodriguez, 26, former retail manager looking for a career change. Jake Williams, 18, high school dropout, trying to get his life back on track. "Great," I said, my voice sounding hollow even to my own ears. "I'll get them oriented tomorrow night." I gathered my things and headed for the back door, eager to get home and try to sleep. But something made me stop and take one last look at the rules sheet hanging inside the manager's office door. At the bottom of the laminated page, written in fresh red ink that hadn't been there the night before, a new rule had appeared. Rule number 8. The trainer must always remain, new crews will come. I stared at the words for a long time, understanding finally dawning on me like a cold sunrise. I wasn't just an employee here. I was part of the restaurant now, bound to it in ways I was only beginning to comprehend. The night shift needed a trainer, and I was it, would always be it. The building fed on the people who worked here after dark, consuming them one by one, but it needed someone to bring in fresh victims, someone to explain the rules, to make the newcomers feel safe, to guide them through their first night just long enough for the place to get its hooks in them. I was the bait, the friendly face that made people trust the job long enough to let their guard down. 5 years of training night crews, and I'd never lost anyone on their first night. They always made it through that initial shift, following the rules carefully, thinking they understood how to stay safe. It was the 2nd or 3rd night when they got comfortable, when they started to think the rules were just corporate paranoia or elaborate hazing. That's when they'd test the boundaries, break one small rule, just to see what would happen. And then they'd join the others in the mural, or the friars, or the 3rd stall, or whatever dark corner of the building had claimed them. But I was beginning to understand something else, something that made my situation even more horrifying. The thing in the basement didn't just want random victims. It was selective, particular about the kinds of people it consumed. It preferred the young, the desperate, the hopeful. People with dreams and ambitions and reasons to live. And it needed me to find them, to bring them here, to prepare them properly. I was more than just bait. I was a collector, a talent scout for an ancient hunger that lived beneath a fast food restaurant in a dying town. As I walked toward my car in the pre-dawn light, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the restaurant windows. But something was wrong with it. While I was moving away from the building, my reflection remained inside, standing behind the counter in my McDonald's uniform, forever frozen in the fluorescent purgatory of the graveyard shift. And as I watched, other reflections appeared beside mine. Tyler, Naomi, Liam, and dozens of others stretching back through the years. All of us trapped in that fluorescent hell. All of us serving the thing that lived beneath the foundation. But there was a difference. While the others looked terrified, trapped, desperate to escape, my reflection looked resigned, accepting, like a man who'd finally understood his purpose in life, even if that purpose was monstrous. I drove home as the sun came up over Millbrook, knowing I'd be back in 16 hours to do it all again. There would be new trainees tomorrow night. There always were. Sarah, Marcus, and Jake would arrive, full of hope and desperation, looking for steady work and a fresh start. And I'd train them, just like I'd trained Tyler and Naomi and Liam. I'd read them the rules, explained the procedures, tried to keep them safe for as long as possible. Most of them wouldn't last the week. Some wouldn't last past their second night. But they'd all make it through that first shift, following the rules carefully, thinking they understood how to survive in this place. That was my job. To make them feel safe long enough for the building to mark them, to claim them, to add them to its collection. The worst part wasn't the guilt, though that was certainly there. The worst part was the knowledge that I'd keep doing it, night after night, year after year, because I didn't have a choice anymore. The building owned me now, just like it owned everyone who'd worked here long enough to understand what it really was. Sometimes, late at night when the restaurant was empty and quiet, I'd hear voices calling my name from the walk-in freezer. Tyler's voice, asking why I hadn't saved him. Naomi's voice, wondering why I'd let her check the bathroom alone. Liam's voice, demanding to know why I brought him here in the first place. I never answered them. What could I say? That I was sorry. That I wished things were different. That if I could trade places with them, I would. All of those things were true, but they didn't change anything. The night shift at McDonald's was always hiring, after all. And someone had to train the new crews. But tonight, as I lay in bed trying to sleep while the sun climbed higher in the sky, I found myself thinking about the basement again. About the room at the end of the tunnel, and the well that sat in its centre, and the thing that lived in the depths below. I'd never seen it directly, had never been brave or foolish enough to peer over the edge of that well. But I'd heard it moving down there, shifting and breathing in the darkness. And sometimes when the wind was just right, I could hear it humming the same lullaby that echoed from the third bathroom stall. A song about hunger and patience and the eternal cycle of feeding and being fed. A song about a place where the golden arches cast shadows that moved independently of the light, where the drive-thru served customers who paid in blood and tears, and where the night shift never really ended. A song about a McDonald's where the rules weren't suggestions, they were prayers. And tomorrow night I'd teach them to 3 new believers, just like I always did. The next evening I arrived at 10:30 as usual. Mrs. Patterson had left the new hire paperwork on my desk, along with another note that simply read, "Good luck." She never asked what happened to the previous trainees, never questioned why we had such high turnover on the night shift. Some things were better left unexamined. Sarah Chen was waiting in the break room when I arrived, looking nervous but determined. She'd dressed professionally for a McDonald's job, wearing a crisp white blouse and black slacks, her hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. Her application mentioned previous experience in customer service and a genuine interest in restaurant management. Marcus Rodriguez showed up a few minutes later, a big guy with calloused hands and tired eyes. Former retail manager, the application said, laid off when his store closed. He needed this job to support his family, had 2 kids and a mortgage to worry about. The kind of quiet desperation that made people ignore warning signs. Jake Williams was the last to arrive, 18 years old and trying to look older, more confident than he felt. High school dropout, probably some family issues or academic struggles that had derailed his education. He was the type who thought working nights at McDonald's was rock bottom, but who'd stick with it because he didn't see any other options. "All right, gather around," I said, setting down my keys and thermos of coffee. The coffee was stronger tonight, triple the usual amount of caffeine. I had a feeling I was going to need it. "Welcome to the McDonald's night shift. I'm Ethan, and I'll be training you for the next week. Before we get started on the register systems and food prep, there's something important we need to go over." I led them to the manager's office, noting how their voices echoed differently in the dimmed overnight lighting. The restaurant was already beginning its nightly transformation, shadows pooling in familiar corners, the hum of the refrigeration units taking on that rhythmic quality that sounded almost like breathing. The rules sheet was exactly where I'd left it, taped to the inside of the door. But now it had 8 rules instead of 7. The newest edition stood out in its fresh red ink. a permanent reminder of my situation. "These are the night shift rules," I said, falling into the familiar rhythm of the orientation speech. "Every person who's lasted more than a week on this shift follows these rules without question. Those who don't follow them, well, they don't work here anymore." As I began to read the rules, I found myself looking at their faces and wondering which one would break first. Sarah was careful and methodical, but she asked too many questions, the kind of person who might decide to investigate things that were better left alone. Marcus had the steady demeanour of someone who'd worked difficult jobs before, but desperation could make people take risks they shouldn't. Jake was young and cocky, exactly the type who'd test the rules just to prove they weren't real. But this time would be different. This time, I'd make sure at least one of them understood. This time, I'd break my own rules. Because after 5 years of feeding the hunger that lived beneath us, after 5 years of watching good people disappear into the darkness, I'd finally found the courage to do what I should have done from the beginning. I was going to tell them the truth. "Rule number 1, I began, my voice steady despite the decision I'd made. "Never look directly at the clown mascot mural after midnight. And I mean that literally. Don't even glance at it. The things painted on that wall aren't just decorations. They're trapped souls, and if you stare too long, you'll join them." The 3 trainees exchanged confused glances. Sarah raised her hand. "I'm sorry, what did you just say?" "Rule number 2, I continued, ignoring her question. "Do not serve anyone who approaches the drive-thru on foot. They're not customers. They're scouts for something that lives in the basement of this building. Something that's been here much longer than McDonald's has." Jake let out a nervous laugh. "Okay, this is getting weird. Are you serious right now?" "Rule number 3. If a customer orders something not on the menu, act like you didn't hear them. Because what they're really ordering isn't food. It's you." I kept reading, but this time I told them everything. The faces in the fryer oil, the children in the freezer, the thing that waited in the 3rd stall, the basement tunnels that stretched farther than should be possible, the well at the end of the world, and my role in all of it. When I finished, the 3 of them sat in stunned silence. "You're insane," Jake said finally. "This is all completely insane." "Maybe," I said, "but in about 4 hours, you'll see for yourself. And when you do, remember what I told you. Follow the rules exactly. Don't test them. Don't question them. And whatever you do, don't trust me to save you. Because I can't. I'm not your trainer. I'm your executioner." As the night progressed, I watched them carefully. Sarah asked fewer questions now, but I could see her mind working, trying to process what I'd told her. Marcus stayed close to the kitchen, avoiding the lobby area entirely. Jake tried to maintain his bravado, but I caught him glancing nervously at the shadows. When the walk-in customer appeared at 11:45, I made sure all 3 of them were watching. When the oil in the fryers turned black at 3:15, and the faces appeared beneath the surface, I pointed them out explicitly. When the lights began to flicker at 4:30, I made sure they understood exactly what was happening. "This is your last chance," I told them as dawn approached. "Quit now. Walk away, find other jobs. Don't come back tomorrow night." "What about you?" Sarah asked. "Why don't you leave?" I showed her the 8th rule, written in red ink at the bottom of the list. "I can't leave," I said simply, "but you still can." As the morning crew arrived and we prepared to end our shift, I watched the 3 of them gathering their things. Sarah looked shaken but thoughtful. Marcus seemed relieved to be leaving. Jake was trying to process everything he'd seen. "So," Jake said as they prepared to go, "same time tomorrow night." I stared at him for a long moment. "That's your choice. But now you know what you're choosing." They left together, talking quietly among themselves as they walked to their cars. I watched them drive away, wondering if I'd see any of them again. The next night, only Sarah came back. She arrived early at 10:15 and found me in the manager's office. "I believe you," she said simply, "about all of it. I spent all day researching this place, looking into the history of the building, the disappearances. You were telling the truth." "Then why are you here?" She was quiet for a moment, looking at the rules sheet taped to the door. "Because someone needs to know. Someone needs to witness what's happening here. And maybe, eventually, someone needs to stop it." And I felt something I hadn't experienced in 5 years of working nights at this place. Hope. "The rules aren't just for survival," I told her. "They're instructions, a feeding schedule. If enough people knew, if enough people refused to follow them, the thing would starve," she finished. "Maybe. Or maybe it would find another way to feed. But at least we'd know we tried." As we prepared for another night shift, I realized that for the first time in 5 years, I wasn't alone. I had an ally. Someone who understood the truth and was willing to fight back. The night shift at McDonald's was always hiring, after all. But maybe, just maybe, we could finally start firing back.